He never knocked. That was the thing Evelyn Harper would remember, long after everything else blurred the way the door to her own home swung open like he already owned it, like the simple act of courtesy was beneath a man of his standing. He walked in with mud on his boots and didn't wipe them. He looked at her 6 children, sitting around the breakfast table and didn't greet them. He looked at them the way a farmer looks at livestock before a sale. "You're behind," he said, dropping a folded paper on the table without clearing space for it, letting it land across 8-year-old Clara's bowl. 30 days passed. The deed reverts to the bank at the end of the week. Evelyn stood at the stove. She didn't turn around right away. She needed that second, just that 1 second to breathe. "My husband's been dead 11 weeks, she said. "I'm aware. The ground's still frozen. I haven't been able to get to Billings to settle the account. That's not my concern, Mrs. Harper." He picked up a tin cup from the counter, looked inside it, set it back down. "Friday. End of business." She turned then. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the pressed collar and the silver watch chain, and the way he held himself like a man who had never once in his life been afraid of anything, because he had never once in his life needed to be. "And if I can't make Friday?" she asked. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already decided the answer before he walked through the door. "Then we make other arrangements," he said, "for the property and for the children." Before you follow Evelyn Harper into the worst winter of her life, take a moment. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Every week we bring you stories like this, stories of ordinary people pushed to the edge of everything they have and everything they are. Drop a comment and tell us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now stay with us, because what happens next to Evelyn and her 6 children is something you will not see coming. The morning Marcus Vale had showed up at her door, Evelyn Harper had already been awake for 2 hours. That was nothing unusual. Sleep had become a stranger since Thomas died, since the night in late November when the deacon boy had come pounding on her door in the dark to tell her they'd found her husband at the base of the North Ridge, his horse standing still beside him, steam rising off the animal's back in the cold. Thomas Harper had been 41 years old. He had been healthy. He had never once fallen from a horse in the 17 years she had known him. Nobody questioned it much. Accidents happened on the frontier. Men died all the time from things that weren't supposed to kill them: a loose rock, a patch of ice, a spooked animal at the wrong moment. The sheriff had come out, looked at the scene, written something in a small ledger, and told Evelyn he was sorry for her loss. He had ridden away before noon. She had 6 children to feed. She didn't have time to ask questions that nobody was willing to answer. The youngest was 3. Her name was Bess, and she still sometimes called for her father in the night without understanding why he didn't come. The oldest was 16, her son Daniel, who had Thomas's jaw and Thomas's stubborn streak and had been trying, with everything a 16-year-old boy had in him, to hold the farm together through the worst winter in a decade. Between them were Hannah, 12, who kept the younger ones occupied and fed, the twins Owen and Eli, 10, who could do a man's work but still fought like children over everything, and Clara, 8, who was quiet in the way. Children sometimes go quiet when they've seen something they're too young to fully understand. 6 children, 11 weeks without Thomas, and now Marcus Vale, standing in her kitchen with mud on his boots, telling her Friday. She stood at the window after he left and watched his horse disappear down the track toward town. The cold came through the glass in a way that wasn't quite visible, but you could feel it like the winter itself pressing in, testing the seams. "Mama." Daniel was behind her. He'd heard everything. Could tell from the way he was standing too straight, jaw clenched, the way Thomas used to stand when he was working hard not to show something. "Don't," she said quietly. "We could go to the sheriff. Holt takes his lunch at Vale's table twice a week. Don't. Then we go to Billings. We go explain it in person. With what money, Daniel? We don't have horses fast enough to make it there and back by Friday. And I'm not leaving you 6 children here alone for 2 days in this cold. She turned from the window. She looked at her son and tried to see him the way she needed to, not as Thomas's echo, not as a boy she needed to protect, but as the person who was standing in this kitchen with her right now. I need you to think clearly, not like someone who's angry, like someone who needs to figure a way out of this. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if there isn't one?" Evelyn didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have one, but because the one she had wasn't the kind a 16-year-old needed to hear from his mother. Not yet. She went back to the stove. She made breakfast. Kept moving. That was the thing about surviving. Kept moving. She had grown up the daughter of a homesteader in Nebraska, one of 5 children, and her father had always said that the land didn't care about your feelings. You could mourn in the evening. In the morning, you got up and you worked. She had carried that into her marriage with Thomas and into every difficult thing that had come after. And there had been difficult things, enough of them that she was not a woman who was easily broken. But the days after Marcus Vale's visit were different. They had a pressure to them that she had not felt before, a specific kind of dread that came not from not knowing what was coming, but from knowing exactly what was coming and not being able to stop it. She went to see Pastor Haverford. Not for comfort. She'd stopped expecting much in the way of comfort from organized quarters, but because he was a man who sometimes had information, and he owed Thomas a favor from 3 winters back. Haverford listened to her, folded his hands on his desk, and said he was deeply sorry, but the law was the law. Couldn't interfere in matters of finance and property. He would pray for her and the children. She thanked him and left. She went to the general store, where Agnes Pratt had run the accounts for 20 years and knew everyone's business. Agnes was sympathetic in the way people are sympathetic when they don't intend to do anything, clucking and soft-eyed, patting Evelyn's hand and saying it was just terrible what had happened, and that Thomas had been such a good man. But when Evelyn asked directly whether Agnes knew of anyone in town who might extend credit or vouch for her at the bank, Agnes's eyes shifted slightly to the side, and she said she just didn't think she could get involved. Vale's reach in Cutter's Creek was long, and Evelyn was beginning to understand just how long. She went home. She told the children everything was being handled. She sat up past midnight with Thomas's ledger open on the table in front of her, running numbers that didn't add up, no matter how many ways she arranged them. Debt was real. She had never disputed that. What she disputed was the amount, which had grown in the months since Thomas's death, in ways that didn't track with any record she could find. The interest Vale was claiming didn't match the original terms. There were fees listed for things she had never heard Thomas mention. She wrote it all down. She wrote down every discrepancy she could find. Took her 3 nights. By Wednesday, she had a list of 14 items that, if anyone with legal authority actually looked at them, would raise serious questions about Marcus Vale's accounting. Problem was that nobody in Cutter's Creek had any intention of looking. Thursday came. The temperature dropped below what the thermometer on the porch could measure. The needle went off the bottom of the gauge. Hannah kept the children inside near the stove, and Evelyn went out to see to the 2 remaining horses. Barn was cold enough to see your breath in great rolling clouds, and the horses were restless, stamping and snorting, sensing something in the air the way animals do before things change. She was throwing hay when she heard the sound of hooves on the frozen road. Multiple horses. She came out of the barn and looked toward the track. 4 riders, coming from the direction of town, and behind them, a wagon with a driver and a man sitting up in the box who she recognized even at that distance. Marcus Vale. A full day early, she didn't move. She stood in the snow in front of her barn and watched them come, and she felt something clarify inside her in that moment, not courage. Exactly. Because courage implies something that can be overcome by fear. It was something more fundamental. It was refusal. A bone-level, unreasonable, inarticulate refusal to let this man walk onto her land and take what was hers without her standing in the way of it. The riders pulled up. Vale descended from the wagon with the careful movements of a man who considers his dignity in all things. He was accompanied by the sheriff and two men she didn't know, large men with the look of hired muscle, the kind that didn't grow naturally in a town this size. "Mrs. Harper," Vale said. He was smiling again. "I thought it would be better if we handled this before you had too much time to make things difficult." "It's Thursday," she said. "I have a prior engagement Friday morning. Thought this would be more convenient. For you. For everyone." He looked around her property with the calm proprietary attention of a man taking inventory. "I've arranged for the children to be placed with families in town. The Murrays have agreed to take the 3 youngest. The older ones can be hired out. There's always work for able-bodied young people, and it'll keep them fed through the winter." Evelyn's heart was hammering. She felt it in her throat, her temples. But her voice came out flat. "You're not separating my children." "I'm afraid that's not your decision anymore, Mrs. Harper." "Where exactly does it say?" "In the foreclosure agreement. When a property reverts, the county has the authority to place dependent minors. Spoken with the magistrate. Everything is legal." He said that last word with particular satisfaction. Everything is legal was the sentence of a man who had arranged very carefully for everything to be legal. She heard the door behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Daniel. Then she heard more footsteps, Hannah, and behind her the smaller sound of the younger ones being held back. Clara's voice asking something in a whisper. "Daniel," Evelyn said, still looking at Vale. "Go back inside." "Mama's inside. The boy can stay," Vale said. "He's old enough to understand how this works. Might be good for him." She took one step toward Vale. Just one. She wasn't sure what she intended. She wasn't a woman given to impulsive action, but something in his tone, the casual, comfortable cruelty of it, the suggestion that this would be educational for her son, pushed through whatever restraint she'd been using to hold herself together. One of the large men moved between them. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He was simply there, blocking. Vale watched this with mild interest, as though watching an experiment. "I'll give you an hour to collect what you can carry," he said. "Property itself, the livestock, the equipment, all of it is being taken to cover the outstanding balance. The children should pack lightly. The Murray family has a full house already." "Over my dead body," Evelyn said. Her voice was very quiet. Vale tilted his head slightly. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I've done this before. I know it feels like the end of everything right now, but there is nothing that you can do." He believed that. She could see it. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was simple certainty, the certainty of a man who had operated in this town long enough that opposition had become literally inconceivable to him. She was still holding the pitchfork she'd been using in the barn. She hadn't noticed until just now. She became aware of it as one of the hired men became aware of it, his eyes dropping to it with professional assessment. She set it against the barn wall, deliberately, without looking away from Vale. "An hour," she said. He nodded. "I'll wait here." She went inside. The children were clustered in the main room, all 6 of them. Bess crying softly and not quite understanding why, the twins wide-eyed and still, Hannah holding Clara by the hand with a fierce, protective grip that made Evelyn's chest seize. "Listen to me," Evelyn said. She knelt down to be at their level. She looked at each of them. "We are not being separated. I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" "What are you going to do?" Hannah asked. She was 12, and she was smart enough to hear what wasn't being said. "I'm working on it," Evelyn said. "Pack 1 bag each. Just what matters." She went to the bedroom. She opened Thomas's old chest at the foot of the bed, the one she hadn't been able to make herself sort through yet, and found the document she'd been looking for since the morning Vale first showed up. A letter folded and worn at the creases, written in a hand she didn't recognize, addressed to Thomas, with a return mark from somewhere in the mountains north of the valley. She'd found it the week after Thomas died, when she'd been going through his coat pockets. She'd read it twice, understood most of it, and hidden it without quite knowing why. She understood why now. She was still reading it when she heard the sound from outside, not Vale's voice, not the horses, but something else. A single sound, heavy and deliberate, the sound of a large animal coming down the road from the north at a pace that wasn't in any hurry. She went to the window. The horse was enormous, black, with the kind of ground-eating stride that meant it had covered serious distance and had more to give. The man on its back was not a man she recognized, but something's about the way he sat unhurried, immovable, was taking in everything without appearing to look at anything, made everyone in the yard go still, including Marcus Vale. The rider pulled up at the edge of the property. He looked at the assembled riders. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Vale with the steady, incurious attention of a man who has encountered many things in the wilderness and has learned to assess all of them with the same calm. Then he swung down from the horse. He was not young somewhere in his 40s, she thought, or perhaps older, in ways that were hard to pinpoint, with the kind of weathered solidity that came from spending years in conditions that stripped everything soft away. He was not dressed for a social call. He was dressed for winter, for mountains, for the kind of country where what you wore determined whether you lived or died. He walked toward Marcus Vale like he had all the time in the world. Vale said, "This is private property, mister." "I'll ask you to—" "Thomas Harper," the man said. His voice was low and flat, without regional affect. "You knew him?" Vale's expression shifted not much, just a flicker, but it was there. Thomas Harper was a debtor who, "I asked if you knew him." The man stopped a few feet from Vale. He didn't square up, didn't posture. He simply stopped. Simple question. There was a long pause. The hired men looked at each other. The sheriff's hand was near his coat, not at his weapon, but near it, the way a man keeps options open. "Yes," Vale said. "I knew him." "Then you'll know that Thomas Harper once kept me from bleeding to death on a ridge, 2 days' ride north of here," the man said. "Stayed with me 3 days when he had no reason to. Packed the wound himself. Went for help when I couldn't move." He paused. "I've been paying that debt for 11 years, without finding the right way to do it. Think I just found it." He reached into his coat. Everyone tensed. He produced not a weapon but a leather pouch, which he held out to the sheriff with the deliberate patience of a man who knows the gesture will be misread and doesn't care. "What's this?" Holt said. "Enough to cover the debt as originally stated," the man said, "plus interest at the legal rate for the county." Not Vale's rate, the county rate. He looked at Vale again. "I believe there's a difference." Vale's face had gone still in a particular way. "Can't just ride in here and—" "I believe I already did," the man said. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her house, the letter from Thomas's coat still in her hand, watching this enormous, quiet stranger systematically remove the floor from beneath Marcus Vale's certainty. And somewhere beneath her fear, beneath her exhaustion and grief and the desperate arithmetic of the past 11 weeks, she felt something tentative and fragile and dangerous stir. Not hope had been beaten out of her too recently for it to come back that fast, but something adjacent to it, something that said, "Wait, just wait and see." The stranger turned from Vale. He looked toward the house, toward her. His expression didn't change it, hadn't changed once through the whole exchange. But there was something in the attention that was different from Vale's inventory-taking assessment. He wasn't looking at what she had or what she owed. He was looking at her. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "my name is Caleb Voss. Your husband wrote to me 6 months before he died. Think you already found the letter." She looked down at the paper in her hand, then back at him. He said if anything ever happened to him, Caleb said, I should come. The yard was completely silent. Even the horses had gone still. "He didn't tell me anything would happen," she said. "No," Caleb said. "He wouldn't have." That wasn't Thomas. He looked at the sheriff, at the hired men, at the wagon that had come to take everything away. But he knew enough to make sure someone was watching. He asked me to watch. Evelyn felt the cold through the doorframe, felt the weight of the letter, felt her children behind her in the house, waiting for her to tell them what came next. "You're 11 weeks late," she said. He absorbed that without flinching. "I know. So whatever you think you came here to do, I came to even the debt. he said. What happens after that is your call, Mrs. Harper. Every bit of it. Vale made a sound, not quite a word, but something dismissive, recovering his composure. This changes nothing, he said. Even if the debt is covered, the property has already been filed under the wrong parcel number, Caleb said, without turning to look at Vale, still looking at Evelyn. The northeast quarter was misrecorded at the county office. I checked on my way through billings. The foreclosure as filed is defective. He paused. You might want to have someone look at your paperwork, Vale. Silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The silence of a man realizing that the ground he thought was solid has shifted beneath him, and he's not yet sure how far. Evelyn Harper stood in the doorway of the house that was still, at least for this moment, hers. She looked at Caleb Voss, this stranger, this man her dead husband had trusted enough to write a letter, and she made a calculation that had nothing to do with money or law or the politics of a town that had already failed her. She made the calculation that a woman makes when she has nothing left to lose, and 6 reasons standing behind her to keep fighting. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee, and then you're going to tell me everything Thomas wrote in that letter. Coffee was the cheap kind Chicory stretched, the way it gets when you're rationing everything, including what you put in a pot, and Evelyn set it on the table without apology. She'd stopped apologizing for what she didn't have sometime around week 3 after Thomas died. Apology took energy she couldn't spare. Caleb Voss sat across from her with his still on, which she appreciated. It meant he wasn't planning to stay longer than the conversation required, or at least that was what it meant to her. And she had learned in 11 weeks to find comfort wherever she could manufacture it. Daniel stood near the doorway to the main room. She hadn't told him to leave, and he hadn't left. He was watching Caleb with the particular intensity of a boy, trying to decide whether a man is worth trusting, which was exactly the right instinct, and she wasn't going to interrupt it. The younger children were in the back room. Hannah had taken them without being asked. Evelyn could hear Bess's occasional murmur and the quiet authority in Hannah's responses, and that small domestic sound of an older sister managing did something to her chest that she didn't have room for right now. She sat down. She put the letter on the table between them. Caleb looked at it, but didn't reach for it. He wrote to you in June, she said. That's when the postmark is from, 6 months before he died. About that. Why? Caleb wrapped both hands around the tin cup. His hands were large, not in a theatrical way, just in the way of a man who had used them constantly for years. There were scars across the knuckles of the left one, old and pale, the kind you stop noticing after a while. He'd found something, he said, on the property. What kind of something? He looked at the letter again, then at her. You read it, you know. I want to hear you say it. A beat. He didn't appear to resent the challenge. He appeared to be deciding how much accuracy mattered in this moment, whether precision was a kindness or the opposite. Mineral deposit, he said. Northeast quarter, the section that runs along the base of the ridge. He'd been finding silver traces in the creek runoff for 2 seasons. Had a friend man named Guthrie, a surveyor out of Helena. Come take a look. Guthrie told him what he'd suspected. Evelyn was very still. How much? She asked. Enough that the right buyer would pay significant money for the rights. Enough that Vale, if he found out, would do whatever it took to get it out from under Thomas before Thomas could file a proper claim. Thomas never said anything to me he was going to, Caleb said. He told me in the letter that he was waiting until he had the paperwork in order. He didn't want to get your hopes up before he was sure. That was Thomas. That was exactly Thomas carrying something enormous alone, because he didn't want to subject his family to the weight of it until he'd already fixed it. She had loved that quality in him. She had also on occasion wanted to throw something at him because of it. He filed a claim, she asked. He tried. Caleb set down the cup. Guthrie got as far as the Territorial Land Office in Helena before someone stopped him. Guthrie's dead, Mrs. Harper. Kicked by a horse is what the official account says. 4 days after he came back from surveying your land. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind working at the corner of the house. Thomas knew, she said. He suspected, he wasn't sure. But he wrote to me after Guthrie died. And what he wrote was he wrote that he was scared and that he didn't have anyone he trusted enough to talk to about it. And he said that if anything happened before he could sort it out, he wanted someone to know. Someone who wasn't connected to this town. Daniel made a sound in the doorway. Not a word more of a sharp exhaled breath, the involuntary sound of a boy absorbing something that reconfigures everything. Evelyn didn't look at him. If she looked at him, right now, she would lose whatever was holding her together. The debt, she said. Manufactured, Caleb said. Or inflated. Vale had enough access to the bank records he sits on the board, which I expect you know, to adjust the figures after Thomas died. Someone who wasn't looking carefully wouldn't see it. Someone who was looking carefully like you were. He glanced at the ledger still open on the side table. Would. I have 14 discrepancies written down, she said. He nodded as though he'd expected that. Those discrepancies, combined with the land filing, Guthrie attempted. There's a federal surveyor's office in Helena that keeps duplicate records. Guthrie would have submitted a copy there, independent of what went through Vale's contacts. That copy exists, it establishes your prior claim. That's a large if yes, he said. It is. She looked at him. And you're telling me all of this why? You paid the debt. You could have walked away. That would have satisfied whatever obligation you felt toward Thomas. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned the cup in a slow circle on the table, a fidgeting motion that seemed unconscious, at odds with the general stillness he projected. Because Vale isn't done, he said. You understand that. Paying the debt as stated stops today's action. It doesn't stop Vale. He's got too much invested in this now. The mineral rights are worth more than the debt, more than your farm, more than whatever he's spent arranging things up to now. He's not going to walk away because I threw gold at a sheriff. So what are you suggesting? She asked. Because I want to be very clear, I am not interested in having a plan suggested to me. I'm interested in facts. I can build my own plan. Something changed in his expression. It was small, a slight adjustment around the eyes, but she'd gotten good. For 17 years of marriage, to a man who was not naturally expressive at reading the small adjustments, he was reassessing her. Good. She'd rather be underestimated and then surprise a person than be overestimated and then disappoint them. The facts, he said. You need to get to Helena before Vale realizes what you're doing. You need to access the Territorial Land Office and find Guthrie's duplicate survey filing. If it's there, you take a certified copy to a lawyer, not a local one, a territorial one, and you file a counterclaim to the mineral rights before Vale can have the original filing buried. How long would that take? A week, if everything went right. More if it didn't. I can't leave 6 children for a week. No, he said. You can't. The implication sat on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't like it. She looked at it some more. You're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, he said. You said you build your own plans. She stood up. She went to the window again. It had become her thinking place over the past weeks. The place where she stood when she needed to look at something that wasn't the inside of her own head. The yard was empty now. Vale had gone. The sheriff had gone. The hired men had gone. The wagon had gone back toward town empty, which she suspected Vale had not enjoyed. He'd be back. Caleb was right about that. You have property north of here, she said. Not a question, she'd heard the name Caleb Voss before. Attached to vague descriptions that varied so wildly from person to person that she'd never assembled them into anything coherent. Mountain man. Trapper. Scout, maybe. Or someone who'd done that kind of work at some point. A name people mentioned with a quality she'd never been able to precisely categorize, not quite respect, not quite fear, something in between. Cabin, he said, up the North Ridge. Not on any land grant. High enough that most people don't bother. You live there alone? Have for a while. She turned from the window. How long is a while? He picked up the cup again. Set it down without drinking. Long enough. Daniel spoke from the doorway. Could she go? If someone were here with us? Could she make it to Helena and back in a week? Caleb looked at the boy, looked at him, the way he'd looked at Evelyn earlier, without judgment, assessing something she couldn't quite name. Weather holds. Yes, he said. Weather doesn't hold, it gets complicated. The weather doesn't look like it's going to hold, Daniel said. No, Caleb agreed. It doesn't. Evelyn sat back down. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them, not at Caleb, not at Daniel, just at her own hands. They were not the hands she'd had at 20. They were cracked at the knuckles from cold and work, the nails cut short, the kind of hands that made a particular kind of woman in this country at this time. She'd stopped being self-conscious about them a long time ago. There's another option, she said. Caleb waited. We go to Helena together. All of us. Nobody spoke for a moment. 7 people, Caleb said. 8, counting you. That's not a journey. That's a migration. I know what it is, she said. But think about the alternative. If I go alone and something goes wrong, Vale has access to my children before I get back. If you stay here with them and Vale decides to push, what then? A fight? That helps no one. She paused. If we're all together, there's no easy target. Caleb looked at her. The weather. I know what the weather is, she said. I've lived on this frontier my entire adult life. I know what a northern winter feels like. I'm not asking you whether it's comfortable. I'm asking whether it's survivable. Another of those small adjustments. It's survivable, he said. If we move fast and we move smart, then we move fast and smart. She looked at Daniel. Her son was standing straight, that overcompensating straightness she'd noticed in him lately, and his jaw was still tight. But there was something in his face now that hadn't been there this morning. Some small, cautious loosening. Start getting things together, she told him. Practical things. Don't let the twins take anything frivolous, or I'll be hearing about it the whole way. He almost smiled. Almost. Yes, ma'am. He disappeared into the back of the house. She could hear the immediate eruption of voices, the twins starting in, Hannah mediating, Bess's register, cutting through everything, and underneath all of it, the particular sound of a family in motion, which was a different sound than a family in stasis. And she was surprised by how much the difference mattered to her. You should know, Caleb said, so when Daniel was gone, that it won't be comfortable where I'm taking you. She looked at him. Caleb, look at this kitchen. Look at this table. Look at these cups. She held up her cracked tin cup. Do I strike you as a woman who requires comfortable? He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the table. He looked at her. No, he said, you don't. They left before noon. It was not a graceful departure. Nothing about moving 8 people, 6 of them children. One of them still in that early volatile toddler stage where any disruption to routine was a potential catastrophe through a Montana winter could be graceful. Bess cried for 20 minutes at the start. Owen and Eli had a genuine shoving altercation over which one of them got to ride closest to Caleb's black horse, which ended when Caleb turned and looked at both of them with an expression so absolutely devoid of anything that both boys went quiet mid-shove and didn't start up again for 2 hours. Clara walked beside Evelyn and held her hand and didn't say much of anything, which was Clara's way, and Evelyn held her hand back and didn't say much either. Hannah managed the rear of the group with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this, managing a cluster of younger children through difficult circumstances for long enough that it had become second nature. She carried Bess on her back when Bess's legs gave out, which happened after the first mile and a half, and she did it without complaint and without the kind of performative martyrdom that an adult might have brought to the same situation. Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything her children did. It was one of the few things she trusted herself to do well. The road north from Cutter's Creek wasn't much of a road, more of a track. 2 ruts in the earth that were frozen hard enough now to be navigable, but would be mud soup in the spring. Climbed steadily, gradually, through country that grew more spare as the elevation increased. Trees changed character, more pine, less of the cottonwood that clustered along the lower creek beds. The branches carrying snow that fell occasionally in small sudden avalanches when the wind shifted. Caleb rode point most of the time, far enough ahead to scout without being out of sight. When the track split or the footing looked questionable, he came back and assessed it before waving the group forward. He didn't explain his reasoning, which initially irritated Evelyn until she realized he wasn't withholding information. He just thought in the way of someone who had spent a long time in country where decisions needed to be made quickly, and explanation was a luxury. You moved or you didn't. You went this way or that way. The reasoning was embedded in the action. Thomas had been the opposite. Thomas had explained everything, sometimes twice, which she had found both endearing and occasionally maddening. And she was thinking about that, about the specific texture of how Thomas's mind worked. When Caleb came back from the crest of a low ridge and said quietly, without preamble, two riders came off the eastern track about a mile back, paralleling us. Evelyn didn't stop walking. Vale's men? Can't say for certain. Could be travelers. But you don't think so? No, he said. I don't. He processed this. The children were strung out along the track behind her, Daniel at the rear now, because she'd repositioned him there. After Caleb's first scouting run, Hannah still carrying Bess, the twins mercifully quiet. What do we do? She asked. Keep moving. We hit the ridge before dark. They lose the advantage of the lower ground. Up high, I know the terrain, and they don't. And if they move before we hit the ridge, then we deal with it. She wanted to ask what deal with it meant, specifically in practical terms, but she looked at his face and decided that the specific answer was not going to be something she could do anything useful with right now. All right, she said. They pushed faster. She didn't tell the children why, just set the pace and let the children calibrate to it the way children do. When they sense something has shifted, and the right response is to follow the adults without asking questions. Even Bess, on Hannah's back, went quiet. The ridge came up in late afternoon, the light already going flat and gray the way it does in winter, when the sun never really commits to being overhead. The track narrowed to a path, then to something that wasn't quite a path at all, but that Caleb navigated without hesitation, the big horse picking its way through the rocks and snows, as though it had done this before, which it probably had. At the top of the ridge, Evelyn turned to look back. Two riders, maybe 3/4 of a mile behind, had stopped at the base of the climb. They weren't following up. She stood there and watched them, her breath making clouds in the cold air. They'll report back to Vale, Caleb said beside her. Tell him you're headed north. He'll figure out where. Your cabin, she said. He knows it exists. Most people in a 50-mile radius know it exists. Whether he'd be willing to come up there with hired men in February. He paused. That's a different question, but not an impossible one. No, he said, not impossible. She turned away from the riders. She looked at her children, arranged on the ridge in various states of exhaustion and altitude-induced wonder, the twins openly gaping at the view despite themselves. Clara leaning against a boulder with her eyes closed. Hannah finally setting Bess down now that the smaller girl had fallen fully asleep and could be transferred to Daniel's arms. She looked at all of them. Then she looked at Caleb. Tell me about this cabin, she said. He turned his horse and started down the far side of the ridge. You'll see it. I'd rather you tell me. He was quiet for a moment, the horse moving steadily. It's big enough, he said, for what it needs to be. It's not very descriptive. No. She walked beside the horse on the downslope, matching its pace. What did you do up there? Before today. Lived. That's also not very descriptive. He glanced at her. There was something in it, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something that existed in the territory between the two. Trapped some, scouted for a mining survey, 2 seasons back. Before that, he stopped. Before that, other things, he said. And then, before she could push, I wasn't always living up here alone. That's probably what you're actually asking. She hadn't been, or she had been, and hadn't wanted to admit it. You don't have to tell me anything, she said. I was making conversation. You don't strike me as someone who makes conversation for its own sake. That was accurate enough that she didn't have an answer for it. I had people, he said after a silence that wasn't quite uncomfortable but had weight to it. A long time ago, they're gone. She didn't ask how. The frontier left very few benign ways for people to be gone, and there were exactly as many ways she wasn't willing to revisit her own grief as there were ways he probably wasn't willing to revisit his. I'm sorry, she said. Thank you, he said. And that was the end of it. Cabin came into view in the last gray light of the afternoon, at the end of a long descent through dense pine. It was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't been sure what she'd expected. It was larger than her farmhouse, built from timber that had been chosen and placed with intention. Not beautiful, exactly, but solid in the way of something built to outlast everything around it. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow. The shutters on the windows were heavy, real wood, and they were latched from the outside. She noticed that last detail and filed it. Caleb dismounted and went ahead to open the door. The inside was cold enough that she could see her breath even after they were in, but it was a sheltered cold, a cold that could be addressed. There was a large fireplace on the main wall and a woodpile stacked beside it that looked like it had been building for a long time. The children came in around her. The twins went immediately to the woodpile because that was the kind of thing 10-year-old boys did assess potential, found things to touch. Daniel carried Bess, who was still mostly asleep, and didn't fully register the transition. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked around with those serious eyes cataloging. Smells like pine, Hannah said. Everything up here smells like pine, Caleb said. He was kneeling at the fireplace, building a fire with the economy of someone who did it enough that it required no thought. You'll stop noticing it in a day or two. A day or two. Evelyn noticed how easily that came out of him, as though the duration had already been calculated and accepted. Bess woke up when the first flame caught and looked around the unfamiliar room with the dangerous pre-cry expression of a 3-year-old encountering the unexpected. Look at the fire, Hannah said immediately, pointing with the tone of someone who had successfully redirected this particular crisis many times before. Isn't it pretty? Bess looked at the fire. Crisis averted. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room and did her own cataloging. There was a main room with the fireplace, a sleeping area on the left, separated by a partition, a shelf of supplies, dried goods, mostly with the disciplined minimalism of someone who had learned exactly what they needed and acquired nothing else. Table. 4 chairs, not 6. She looked at the table. 4 chairs. Something about that number, in the context of everything else he had told her and hadn't told her, settled in her chest with a quiet, specific weight. He had once had people. Now he had 4 chairs for a table he sat at, alone. She went to work. There was nothing else to do. The children were cold, and cold children needed warm food, and warm food meant she needed to inventory what was available and figure out how to make it feed 8 people. She found dried beans and salt pork, and enough flour for biscuits, if she was careful, and she set Hannah to work on the biscuits without apology. Caleb watched this reorganization of his kitchen with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not objection, something closer to the look of a man watching something happen that he'd forgotten was possible. You don't have to, he started. The children need to eat, she said. This isn't charity. This is logistics. He closed his mouth. He went to see to the horse. Daniel helped her without being asked, moving around the small kitchen space with the specific competence of a boy who had been filling in for a dead father for 11 weeks and had gotten somewhat good at it out of sheer necessity. He wasn't graceful about it. He knocked a spoon off the shelf and caught it wrong, and it clattered, and he swore under his breath and then looked at his mother with the particular mortification of a 16-year-old who has cursed in front of a parent. She handed him the beans. Soak these. He took the beans. They ate around the fire because there weren't enough chairs, and they spread what bedrolls Caleb had onto the floor, and that became their table. The children sitting on the floor with their tin plates balanced on their knees, which the twins thought was marvelous and said so loudly, and even Clara smiled at the general dishevelment of it. Caleb sat in one of the chairs outside the circle of children eating in the solitary manner of a man who'd forgotten how to be inside a group and was relearning the geometry of it. Evelyn sat on the floor with the children, which was not where she would have put herself if she'd been thinking about hierarchy. But she'd stopped thinking about hierarchy around week 2 of Thomas's death and hadn't gone back. Bess fell asleep against her arm before she finished eating. Evelyn moved her carefully to a rolled blanket by the fire and sat looking at the back of her smallest child's head, at the fine hair and the particular tuck of her sleeping position, and felt the tiredness of the day land on her, all at once, like something she'd been out running finally catching up. She became aware that Caleb was watching her, not intrusively, not in any way she could call uncomfortable, even but she'd been watched by men for enough of her life to be accurate about the different qualities of attention. And this one was not predatory or calculating, or even particularly curious. It was something else, something she didn't have the right word for. She looked up. He didn't look away, which she appreciated. Men who looked away when they were caught at something were generally a certain kind of man, and she didn't have patience for them. "The shutters," she said. He waited. "They latch from the outside," she said. "I noticed when we came in." "Yes," he said. "Old design or deliberate?" "Deliberate," he said. "The bears up here don't knock either." She absorbed this. "The latch keeps bears out?" "Keeps the door from blowing open in weather," he said. "Easier to reinforce from outside when I'm doing roof work or something similar." I added the latch 3 winters back after a storm took the door off its upper hinge. He paused. "If you're asking whether you can get out from the inside, yes. The inner bolt works independently." She had been asking that. She hadn't quite phrased it as a question, but she had been asking it, and he had known she was asking it. "I'm not in the business of keeping anyone," he said. "I want that said plainly." "All right," she said. "I made a promise to Thomas. Getting you somewhere Vale can't easily reach was part of it. The rest of what comes next is yours to decide." She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up, pressing at the walls of the cabin, with the purposeful persistence of a Montana winter that wasn't done being a Montana winter. Inside, the fire was steady. Bess was asleep. Owen was asleep. Eli's was fighting sleep with the grim determination of a boy who didn't want to miss anything and was going to lose the fight in approximately 4 minutes. "What did you promise him?" "Exactly," she asked. "The whole of it." Caleb set his plate down. He looked at the fire. "That I'd come if something happened. That I'd make sure you and the children were safe." He paused. He said one more thing. "What?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, working through something, the way people do when they're trying to find the accurate version of something they've been carrying for a while. He said that if I came and found you in trouble, not to underestimate you, Caleb said. He said his exact words, as close as I can remember. He said, "She'll find a way out of it. What she'll need is someone to give her room to do that without getting in the way." Evelyn looked at the fire. That was Thomas. That was entirely, precisely, characteristically Thomas. Even in a letter written in fear for his life, even in the act of reaching out to someone for help, he had thought to say that, to make sure that whoever came understood what she was. Kept her face still. She was good at that. He was right, she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I figured that out about an hour after I rode in." One by one the children went to sleep, even Eli finally losing his battle with exhaustion and tipping sideways into his brother in a way that would have annoyed Owen if Owen hadn't already been asleep and unable to object. Hannah arranged herself around Clara the way she always did. Even here, in a strange man's cabin on a mountain in the middle of a crisis, the instinct for protecting the younger ones, so embedded, it operated independent of circumstance. Daniel stayed awake the longest. He sat across the fire from his mother, and they looked at each other, and had a full conversation without saying a word, the way she and Thomas used to do, and she saw with sudden clarity how much of Thomas was in this boy. Not just the jaw, but the quality of the attention, the particular weight of his silences. She nodded at him. He nodded back. He went to sleep. Caleb was at the table, writing something in a small ledger by candlelight. She didn't ask what. She banked the fire and made sure the children were covered, and stood by the window for a few minutes, looking out at the dark, at the snow that had started falling sometime in the last hour, fine and steady, covering the tracks they'd made, coming up, covering their trail. That was useful. She should sleep. She knew she should sleep. The morning would require decisions, and decisions required something more than the hollow alertness of exhaustion. But the thing about the quiet, about the absence of the pressure and noise of the day, was that it let the thoughts come that she'd been out running since Marcus Vale had walked into her kitchen. Thomas had known. He'd known something was wrong, known someone was watching the land, known enough to be scared and to write a letter and to ask for help, and he hadn't told her. And now he was dead, and she was on a mountain in a stranger's cabin with 6 children, and a ledger full of discrepancies, and a promise from a man she hadn't known existed yesterday. She didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. She settled, as she usually did with Thomas, on something in between. She was fluent in that in between. Mrs. Harper. She turned. Caleb was still at the table. He hadn't looked up from his ledger. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm aware. The thinking you're doing right now is the kind that doesn't resolve itself at night," he said. "Kind you need daylight for. I know that too. Knowing and doing are different things." She looked at him, the top of his head, bent over his writing. "Do you sleep?" she asked. A pause. "Enough. That's not an answer." "No," so he said. "I suppose it's not." He turned a page in the ledger. "I'll keep watch through the first part of the night. Those riders won't come up in the dark. But I'd rather know for certain." She wanted to argue it felt wrong, somehow, to have him sitting watch while she slept. A kind of debt she didn't know how to account for. But he was right about the thinking. And he was right about the daylight. And she was not a woman who let pride get in the way of practical sense. "Wake me at the midpoint," she said. "I'll take the second watch." He looked up then. She could see the faint surprise in it, the assumption he'd apparently made. Without examining it, that she wouldn't offer. "You don't need to." "I know," she said. "Wake me anyway." She lay down near the children, her back to the fire. The floor was hard, and the blanket she'd been given was thin, and the sounds of the mountain wind, the settling of the cabin, the breathing of her sleeping children were all different from the sounds she'd spent 17 years falling asleep to. She was asleep inside 4 minutes. The body, when it has been pushed long enough, eventually makes that decision independently, and hers did. Dreamed about Thomas, not the way he'd been at the end, not the frozen ridge, not the horse standing still in the dark, but the way he'd been before that, years before, standing in a field in summer with his hand up to shade his eyes, looking at something on the horizon she couldn't see from where she stood. She called to him. In the dream he turned, and he was smiling. The specific smile he had that was really more of a loosening, a relaxation of the face he wore for the rest of the world. He said something she couldn't hear. The wind took it. She woke to Caleb's hand, not on her shoulder, but near it, a light tap on the floor beside her that was enough. She was awake and oriented in less than a second. Motherhood had done that for her, the capacity for instant full wakefulness. She sat up. He handed her a cup of something hot. Not coffee, some kind of herb, bitter but warming. "Anything?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," he said. Quiet all the way down. She took the cup. He went to the sleeping area without further exchange, with the efficiency of 2 people who have worked out a practical arrangement and don't require ceremony around it. She sat by the fire and watched her children sleep, and watched the window where the snow was still coming down, and felt the particular weight of everything that was coming, without quite being able to see the shape of it yet. Vale would move when the weather cleared. She had maybe 2 days, possibly 3. She needed to figure out what she was going to do with those days. Not what Caleb thought she should do, not what Thomas had tried to arrange from beyond a letter written in fear. She was going to do. The woman who had 14 discrepancies written down in her own hand, and a dead surveyor's name, and a mountain between her and the man who had stolen everything from her family, pulled out the list, spread it on her knee by the firelight. She read it again from the start. She was still reading when the first pale light began at the edge of the window, and the cabin started its slow return from dark to something she could work with. You've used 75% of your weekly limit. Get more usage. The list had 14 items on it when she started. By the time the children woke up, it had 19. She'd found the additional 5 in the second hour of watch, working through the figures again, with the slow, methodical attention of someone who had nothing to do but sit by a fire and think. The discrepancies weren't dramatic. That was the thing about Vale's accounting that made it so effective. Nothing stood out as obviously fraudulent to a casual eye. It was death by accumulation. A fee here, a rate adjustment there, a compounding calculation that used the wrong baseline, a penalty applied before the grace period had technically expired. Each individual item, looked at alone, could be explained away as clerical error or honest misunderstanding. Together across the full ledger, they told a different story. She had the story written down in her own hand. By the time Caleb came out of the sleeping area, boots already on, moving with the morning efficiency of a man who didn't waste time on the transition between sleep and wakefulness. He looked at her. She was still on the floor by the fire, the ledger copy spread across her signet, the list of 19 items beside it. "You didn't sleep after I came back," he said. "I slept enough. That's what I said last night." "Then we're evenly matched," she said, and held up the list. "Sit down. I need you to look at something." He sat. He took the list. He read through it without comment, which she appreciated. Some men, when handed a document by a woman, had a particular way of scanning it that communicated they were performing the act of reading rather than actually doing it. Caleb read it the way she would have wanted a lawyer to read it, line by line, pausing in certain places, going back once to recheck something. "The third item," he said. "The penalty fee dated December 9th. Thomas died November 23rd, she said. Vale applied a non-payment penalty for December, before the estate had even been formally notified of the debt schedule. The notification letter, which I still have, is dated December 14th. Caleb set the paper down on the floor between them. "That's the one that breaks it open," he said. "That's not clerical error. You cannot accidentally apply a penalty before you've sent the notification. The sequence is impossible." That's what I thought. Territorial judge would see that in 30 seconds. If we can get it in front of a territorial judge. She paused. "Brings me back to Helena." He nodded slowly. "We need to move in the next 2 days. Maybe less." She looked toward the window. The snow that had been falling when she took watch was finished, and the sky outside had that particular pale clarity that came after a storm passed, which meant the riders who'd paralleled them yesterday had a clear road this morning. "They'll tell Vale which direction we went," she said. "They already did. He knows we came north. He knows about your cabin specifically. He knows a cabin exists. Whether he knows the exact approach," Caleb stopped. "He has men who've been in this country a while. Give him 2 days and he'll know the approach." She thought about that. "Then we have 1 day." He didn't disagree, which was its own kind of confirmation. The children woke in stages best first, with the disoriented crying of a child, registering an unfamiliar ceiling, which Hannah resolved with the automatic ease of long practice. Then the twins simultaneously, as though they shared a biological alarm. Then Clara, quiet and self-contained, folding her blanket with a neatness that nobody had ever specifically taught her. Then finally Daniel, who came awake with a start and was on his feet and scanning the room before he'd fully surfaced from sleep, which Evelyn noticed and didn't comment on. He'd been doing that since Thomas died, waking like something was wrong, posed something had been wrong, for 11 weeks, so the instinct wasn't unreasonable. Breakfast was spare more of the dried goods, supplemented by the small amount of jerked meat Caleb had in his stores, and the last of the biscuit flour from the night before. She stretched it as far as it would go. The twins ate without complaint, which told her they understood, at some level, that this was not the moment for complaint. After the children ate, Evelyn put Hannah in charge of the younger ones and took Daniel and Caleb to the far end of the cabin, away from the others. "Here's what I'm thinking," she said, without preamble. "We can't all go to Helena. We can't leave the children here alone. We can't stay here and wait for Vale to come up the mountain." She looked at Caleb. "You know this country better than anyone. Is there somewhere a family, a homestead, someone trustworthy within half a day's travel of here, where the children could stay while you and I go on to Helena?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "There's a woman," he said, "Marta Hedstrom. Runs a place about 4 hours east in the Broken Creek Valley. Widow. She and her son work cattle. She's not," he chose the word carefully, "connected to town. She doesn't trade at Cutter's Creek. Goes to Billings direct. She'd take them? I've done work for her. Helped her get through a bad winter 3 years back. Take them if I asked." He paused. "She's not a soft woman, and she runs a hard operation. It won't be comfortable." "You keep saying that," Evelyn said. "I keep not caring." Something moved in his expression again, that small adjustment she was getting better at reading. "Right," he said. "Daniel comes with us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Mama," Daniel said immediately, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for an opening. "You're the only other person who's seen the ledger," she said. "You know the figures. If something happens to me, or I'm incapacitated, or I need someone to verify the accounting, nothing's going to happen to you, Daniel." She said it the way she said his name when she needed him to set down the argument. And here, he set it down. "I need you with me. The little ones will be safe with this woman. Hannah can manage them for a few days." He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. He didn't like leaving the younger children, didn't like the exposure of the journey, didn't like any of the variables he couldn't control. Thomas's son through and through. "All right," he said. She nodded. "Get your things together. We leave within the hour." Telling Hannah was harder than she'd expected, which she should have expected, because Hannah, at 12, had a precise and unsentimental intelligence, and a way of receiving information that stripped it of any protective softening. Evelyn told her directly, all of it where they were going, why, what Marta Hedstrom's place would be like, roughly how long they'd be gone. Hannah listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, Hannah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And if you're not back in 5 days?" Evelyn looked at her daughter. "I'll be back in 5 days." "I know you'll try to be," Hannah said. "I'm asking what we do if you're not." Evelyn felt the specific pride and grief of raising a child who was smarter than the situation required her to be. "Caleb will leave instructions with Marta. She'll know what to do." "Does she know our situation?" "She will by the time we leave you there." Hannah absorbed this. She looked at the younger children, Owen and Eli, who were inexplicably engaged in trying to balance sticks across the tops of their boots. Clara, who was drawing something in the frost on the window, with one finger, Bess, who was sitting near the fire, eating the last of her biscuit, with total concentration. "Okay," Hannah said. She turned back to her mother. "Don't be longer than 5 days, I won't," Evelyn said. She didn't promise. Hannah would have noticed the distinction, and she didn't want that conversation. They set out in 2 groups, which had been Caleb's suggestion, and the right one, he took the children east toward Marta Hedstrom's with the horse, while Evelyn and Daniel broke camp and assembled what they'd need for the Helena journey. She didn't like watching her children ride away. She stood in the cabin doorway and watched until the horse was out of sight among the pines, and then she stood there for another minute after that, looking at the empty space where they'd been. Then she went inside and packed. Caleb came back 2 hours later. He came back alone, which she'd known he would, but which still landed. Oddly, the absence of the children made the cabin feel both larger and somehow more exposed, as though the noise they generated had been structural, had been holding something up. "She'll take them," he said. He was stamping snow from his boots at the door. Hannah introduced herself and gave Marta a summary of the situation before I'd finished explaining. Marta said your daughter was formidable. "She is," Evelyn said. "The little one cried," he said. "She would have." Hannah handled it. "She always does." They left within the half hour. 3 people now, instead of 8, which changed the speed significantly. They moved fast across the post-storm snow, Caleb breaking trail, Evelyn and Daniel behind him in single file, the kind of travel that didn't allow for much conversation and didn't require it. The country south of the ridge was different than the north face, more exposed, longer sight lines, the wind coming across the open ground without anything to break it. Evelyn walked and thought. Walking always helped her think. Thomas used to say she thought better on her feet than sitting down, which was true, and she'd taken it as a straightforward observation until she realized one day that he'd been arranging things, walks, errands, tasks that required her to be in motion whenever she was stuck on something difficult, quietly, without announcing it. That was Thomas. By the time they stopped at mid in the lee of a rocky outcrop to eat and rest briefly, she had organized what she knew into something she could work with. Vale had killed Guthrie, or arranged it. He had manufactured or inflated the debt against Thomas's estate. He had attempted to use the legal mechanism of foreclosure and minor placement to dispossess her family and claim the land. He had done all of this because beneath the northeast quarter of the Harper property lay a silver deposit valuable enough to make murder worth the risk. What she had: 19 documented discrepancies in the debt accounting, at least one of which was not explicable as error. The original letter from Thomas to Caleb, which described the mineral find, and Guthrie's survey, the knowledge that Guthrie had filed a duplicate record in Helena, Caleb's testimony, which corroborated Thomas's letter, Daniel's familiarity with the ledger. What she needed, the duplicate survey record, a territorial lawyer willing to take the case, and enough time to file before Vale could suppress either. What she didn't have, any certainty that the duplicate record still existed, any certainty that a lawyer in Helena would see the case the way she saw it, any guarantee that Vale didn't have eyes in Helena the same way he had eyes in Cutter's Creek. She was still working through the gaps when Daniel said, from beside her, "Someone's been through here recently," followed his eyes. Tracks in the snow, heading south. Multiple horses, the snow around them not yet wind-softened, which meant recent. Caleb crouched beside the nearest track and studied it. He didn't say anything for a moment. 4 horses, he said. 6 to 8 hours ahead of us. Headed south, Evelyn said, toward the main road to Billings. He looked up. Or toward the cutoff that comes back around to Cutter's Creek. So they could be Vale's men doubling back. Could be independent travel. But you don't think so. He stood up. I think we should adjust our route. The adjustment added 3 hours to the journey. It took them off the main track and through country that was harder going, steeper grades, more trees, the kind of terrain that Caleb navigated without apparent difficulty and that Evelyn navigated through the straightforward application of stubbornness. Daniel kept up without complaint, and she noted this with private satisfaction. Whatever the next days required, her son would not be the limiting factor. They camped the first night in a shallow cut in a hillside, not a true shelter but enough to break the wind. Caleb built a fire small enough to give heat without visibility. The 3 of them ate in the close, quiet way of people who are conserving more than food. Daniel fell asleep, propped against the rock wall, his chin dropping by degrees until it hit his chest, and he startled awake, and then gave up and let himself tip sideways. Evelyn was on watch. Caleb sat across the small fire, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You've done this before," she said eventually. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Which part?" "This. Moving people through rough country when someone's looking for them." He fed a small stick into the fire. "Some version of it. During the war?" A pause after. "The work I did after was." He stopped, started again. "I worked for a federal survey commission for a while. There were parts of that job that weren't strictly surveying." She let that sit for a moment. "You were a marshal?" "An adjunct. Unofficial." He looked at the fire. "The distinction matters less than you'd think when you're in the middle of it. What happened? To the work?" "To you," she said. "You said you had people. Then you didn't. Then you were on a mountain alone." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, "My wife, my son." He paused between each word like he was setting down something heavy. Fever, 1872. I was in the field and I didn't get back in time. He was quiet again. That's all of it. She didn't say she was sorry again. She'd already said it once, and she was not a woman who repeated herself in the crucial registers. She let the fire sit between them, and she let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not comfortable exactly, but honest. After a while she said, "Thomas would have liked you." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not breaking. Nothing so dramatic, but a slight softening around the edges. He wrote well, Caleb said. The letter. He wrote like a man who thought carefully before he put things down. Did, she said. Everything he did, he thought carefully first. Sometimes too carefully. Sometimes while he was thinking, things were already moving. Like this, she said. They were quiet again, and this time it was a different quality of quiet, the kind that comes when two people have exchanged something and settled into the shared weight of it. She was still on watch when he fell asleep against the rock. He didn't mean to. She could see the moment it happened, the subtle change in his breathing, the slight drop of his shoulders, and she thought he probably hadn't slept much the night before either. She kept watch and thought about Thomas, and thought about the mineral deposit beneath the northeast quarter, and thought about the 19 discrepancies, and thought about Guthrie's duplicate filing in Helena, which may or may not still exist, and which was the hinge point of everything. If it existed, she had a case. If it had been suppressed or destroyed, she had a difficult argument and a dead surveyor and the word of a mountain man against a banker with political connections. She preferred not to depend on other people's goodwill. She had been in situations before that required her to depend on it, and the results had been instructive. She would assume the filing was gone. She would work backward from that assumption and find another way. By the time the fire burned low and the first birds began somewhere in the pines, she had found another way. It wasn't elegant. It relied on a chain of legal logic that would need someone with actual territorial law knowledge to translate into actionable process. But the foundation of it was in her list, in those 19 items, and specifically in the December 9th penalty fee that could not have been applied when it was applied without the person applying it knowing in advance that the notification letter hadn't been sent yet. You can only know that if you wrote the notification letter. You can only have written the notification letter if you controlled the bank's correspondence. Vale's name was not on the bank's official leadership, which she had checked when she found the first discrepancies. He was a board member. But board members don't write notification letters, which meant someone at the bank had applied the penalty fee on Vale's instruction, which meant there was a clerk or a manager or someone who had done something they probably hadn't thought would be traceable because Vale had told them it wouldn't be. Those people existed. They were in Cutter's Creek right now, going about their lives, believing that no one had connected the specific date sequence of a penalty fee to the specific date of a notification letter. She had connected it. She held that thought as the sky began to lighten, and she felt something she recognized as a particular kind of focus, not anger, not satisfaction, but the cold, clear quality of a mind that has found the thread and knows which direction to pull. They reached the outskirts of Helena on the afternoon of the second day. Helena was not a large city, but it was large enough to have a federal land office, a territorial courthouse, and a legal establishment substantial enough that its lawyers had clients other than the local gentry. Walking into it from the rough country they'd come through felt like a kind of dislocation, the sudden presence of buildings and horses and commerce after 2 days of nothing but trees and snow. Evelyn didn't give herself time to feel out of place. She had learned years ago that out of place was mostly a state of mind and could be managed by moving with purpose and looking like you knew where you were going. The Territorial Land Office was a 2-story building on the main street with a federal seal. Above the door that had seen better days, the paint was peeling at the corners, and one of the mounting bolts had worked loose and left the whole thing listing slightly. felt to Evelyn like an honest advertisement for the institution's resources. Clerk's inside was young mid-20s, she guessed, with the overwhelmed look of someone managing a filing backlog with insufficient staff. He looked up when the three of them came in, and his eyes moved between them with the assessment that Evelyn had long since stopped being surprised as by. The woman, the man, the boy, trying to determine the configuration. I need to access a duplicate survey filing, Evelyn said. The original was submitted by a James Guthrie, licensed surveyor out of Helena, in the spring or early summer of last year. Property in question is in the Cutters Creek area, northeast quarter section registered under Harper. Clerk blinked. Ma'am, the filing records from last year are in the archives storage. I understand it's not a simple request, she said. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for thorough. She set the ledger copy and the list of discrepancies on his counter. I have documentation suggesting that the property in question is the subject of a fraudulent foreclosure proceeding. If the Guthrie survey exists in your archive, it establishes a prior mineral rights claim that supersedes the foreclosure. If it doesn't exist, she paused, then I need to know that too, and I need that absence documented. The clerk looked at the documents, looked at her, looked at Caleb, who was standing slightly behind Evelyn's left shoulder in the particular way of someone who is present, but has made a decision to let someone else do the talking. This could take some time, the clerk said. I have time, she said. I don't have much of it, but I have some. I'll wait. They waited in the anteroom. Daniel sat with his back to the wall and his arms folded, watching the door with the same intermittent vigilance he'd had since Thomas died. Caleb stood at the window, looking at the street with the same quiet attention he gave to the ridge line and the tree line and the track behind them. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and did not allow herself to think about what happened if the filing wasn't there. An hour passed. Then another. The clerk came back with a different expression than the one he'd left with. More careful, more deliberate, and he was carrying a folder. The Guthrie survey, he said. He set it on the counter. His voice had changed, taken on the particular neutrality of someone being very precise about what they do and don't say. It was filed on the 14th of June of last year. It's in good order. The original is logged. Evelyn looked at the folder. She did not reach for it yet. It's intact, she said. Question. It's intact, the clerk confirmed. He met her eyes for a moment, and she understood from the quality of that eye contact brief, specific, with a slight additional pressure, that the folder was intact, and that there had perhaps been a moment when it might not have been, and that she was receiving information she was not being told in words. She reached for the folder. The survey was thorough, more thorough than she dared to hope. 6 pages of technical documentation in Guthrie's careful hand, with measurements and sample locations, and a preliminary assay attached from a Helena mineralogist who had examined the samples Guthrie had brought back. Assay was not preliminary in the way of someone hedging. It was preliminary in the way of someone who had seen enough to be certain, and was being professionally restrained about how he said so. Silver content in the northeast quarter samples was exceptional. The mineralogist had underlined that word. Exceptional. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Caleb. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture adjusted a slight settling, like a man who has been carrying a weight slightly wrong and has found the right grip. This is enough, he said quietly. It's enough for the claim, she said. I still need the foreclosure challenged on its own terms. The claim doesn't automatically unwind the foreclosure. Vail still has the debt argument and the procedural filing. The procedural filing is defective, Caleb said. I checked the parcel numbers in billings on my way through. Defective can be corrected, she said. A defective filing that's corrected is still a valid foreclosure if the underlying debt is upheld. She looked at the survey. I need a lawyer. The clerk, who had been doing a professional job of not appearing to listen, said, without looking up from his own work, there's a territorial practice on 2nd Street, Halloran and Associates. They take federal land cases up. pause. Mrs. Halloran handles most of them personally. Evelyn looked at the clerk. He was still looking at his own work. Thank you, she said. She took the survey and walked out. Halloran and Associates occupied 3 rooms above a hardware store. The stairs were steep, and the landing at the top had a crack in the floorboard that had been there long enough to have a worn edge, which Evelyn stepped over automatically because she'd spent 17 years in a farmhouse where you learned the floor's particular problems, and worked around them. Margaret Halloran was not what Evelyn had expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. A woman in her 50s, heavyset in a way that was about solidity rather than softness, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and an expression that communicated she had heard many things and been surprised by very few of them. She listened to Evelyn for 23 minutes without interrupting. Evelyn knew because there was a clock on the wall behind Mrs. Halloran's desk, and she watched it while she talked, keeping the account organized, presenting the facts in the sequence that built the case most clearly rather than the sequence in which she'd experienced them. When Evelyn finished, Mrs. Halloran picked up the list of 19 discrepancies. Put on her glasses, she read. When she got to item 3, the December 9th penalty fee, she stopped. She looked up at Evelyn over the glasses. You found this yourself? She said. Yes. You trained in accounting? I trained in keeping my family fed on a frontier farm for 17 years, Evelyn said, which is a different thing, but arrives at some of the same skills. Mrs. Halloran looked at her for a moment, and something in her expression adjusted. She looked at the list again. The notification letter is dated December 14th, she said, more to herself than to Evelyn, and the penalty was applied December 9th. Yes. He applied the penalty 5 days before he sent the notification. Mrs. Halloran set the list down. She took off her glasses. She did something that Evelyn had not expected from a woman whose entire professional presentation communicated that she was not easily moved. She made a short, sharp sound of satisfaction. Not quite a laugh. Something between a laugh and a verdict. Well, she said, well, I know it's not the only piece, Evelyn said. The survey strengthens the property rights claim independently, but the foreclosure challenge needs to stand on its own. The December 9th item breaks the foreclosure on its own, Mrs. Halloran said. Potentially, if I can get us in front of Judge Alderman before Vale files a corrected petition. She looked at Caleb, who was standing in the corner with his hat in his hands, in the posture of a man who knows when he is in someone else's territory. You're prepared to testify regarding Thomas Harper's letter and the circumstances of your contact with him? Yes, Caleb said. And she looked at Daniel, can verify the ledger figures. I grew up with that ledger, Daniel said. I know it better than he does. Mrs. Halloran looked at the boy for a moment. The kind of look that measures and lands somewhere specific. Good, she said. Then here's what we're doing. She was already reaching for paper, already moving into the operational mode of a woman who has decided on a course and sees no reason for delay. I'm filing an emergency injunction against the foreclosure, proceeding on the grounds of procedural fraud. That gets us a hearing. The hearing is where we use the survey and the full accounting challenge. The survey establishes that the property has outstanding mineral rights that were not disclosed in the original debt agreement, which means Vale had an undisclosed conflict of interest when he structured the loan. Evelyn had not put that particular piece together. She had been so focused on the accounting that she hadn't worked all the way to the loan structuring. He knew about the silver when he issued the original loan, she said. Did he? Mrs. Halloran said, with the tone of a woman asking a rhetorical question she already knows the answer to. Or did he discover it afterward? Because the answer to that question changes what we're dealing with from improper collection practices to something considerably more serious. The room was quiet for a moment. Guthrie filed his survey in June. Caleb said slowly, the original loan was issued in March of the same year. So he either discovered it between March and June and then decided to manufacture a basis for foreclosure, Evelyn said. Or Guthrie wasn't the first surveyor to look at that land, Caleb said. He looked at Evelyn. Thomas said Guthrie was the first he'd brought in. But he wouldn't necessarily have known if someone had surveyed the property before he bought it. Evelyn thought about the date Thomas had bought the farm, 7 years ago, before the mineral survey methods in this region had become sophisticated enough to find what Guthrie found. But Vale had been in this county for 15 years. He knew, she said. It came out quiet, not heated. He's known for years. He sold Thomas the land without disclosing the mineral potential. He's been waiting. Waiting for what? Daniels said. Waiting for Thomas to establish the property, she said. Waiting for the farm to be worth taking. Thomas built it up, brought in water rights, cleared the northeast section for grazing, built the access road along the ridge. All of that increased the value of the mineral access exponentially. She could feel the shape of it now, the whole architecture of it, and it was worse than she'd thought, not because it was more violent, but because it was more deliberate, more patient. He was never going to let us keep it. Debt was always the tool. He just needed the right moment to use it. And Thomas found the mineral deposit before Vale was ready to move, Caleb said. So Vale moved the timeline up, she said. And Thomas, she stopped. Thomas wrote to me, Caleb said, because he knew. The room held that for a moment. All four of them, in this cramped office above a hardware store in Zelena in the gray February afternoon, with the terrible patience of a dead man's understanding finally fully visible. Mrs. Halloran. Mrs. Halloran was writing. She had been writing through most of this, and when she looked up the quality of someone who has just taken careful aim at something specific, "I'll need 3 days to prepare the injunction properly," she said. "Can you be in Helena for 3 days?" "We're not going back to Cutter's Creek," Evelyn said. "No," Mrs. Halloran said. "I wouldn't recommend that. Is there somewhere you can be that's not easily found?" Evelyn said. Mrs. Halloran looked at Caleb. "There's a boarding house on the north end of town," he said, "run by a woman named Pierce. She's quiet." 3 days, Mrs. Halloran repeated. She looked at Evelyn. "And then I need you at the courthouse. All 3 of you." "We'll be there," Evelyn said. They left the office in the failing light of the February afternoon, the 3 of them moving down the steep stairs and back onto 2nd Street. The hardware store beside the staircase was closing the owner, pulling in a display of tools from the boardwalk, the metal implements clanking together in the cold. Daniel walked beside her. He hadn't said much since the office, and she let him be quiet. After half a block, he said, "He planned it for years." "Yes," she said. "He let Dad buy that land knowing he was going to take it. That's what it looks like." Daniel was quiet for another half block. Dad knew at the end. He knew what Vale was. He knew enough, Evelyn said. He just didn't know soon enough. "If he'd told you," "I know." She said it without bitterness. She had been through that particular room in her head multiple times in the last 48 hours, and she'd come out the other side each time, and it was still a room she didn't want to live in. He was trying to protect us from something that wasn't finalized yet. That's what he did. He carried things until he'd figured out the solution. She paused. He ran out of time. Daniel made a sound. She didn't look at him, because if she looked at him, she would see that he was 17 and had just understood something about his father that no 17-year-old should have to understand, and she did not have the reserves right now to hold him through that and hold herself through it at the same time. "He wrote the letter," she said. "He made sure someone was coming." "That's not nothing, Daniel." "He didn't run out of time before he did that." They walked. The street was quieter now, the afternoon commerce subsiding into the early evening transition. Caleb was a few steps ahead, giving them the space she hadn't asked for, which she recognized as the particular consideration of a man who had lost his own people and knew what it looked like from the outside. She thought about the 3 days. Vale would know by now that they'd left the mountain. He might know they were in Helena. He might have people here, not officials, and necessarily, but the kind of people that money bought in a place like this, the kind who kept their ears open in offices and boarding houses and land offices. 3 days was a long time in that context. She needed to think about that. She needed to think about how you spent 3 days in a city where you might be being watched, preparing for a legal hearing that the person you were building the case against would try every available means to stop. The boarding house on the north end was a narrow two-story building that backed up against a frozen creek. The woman who ran it, Pierce, as Caleb had said, was compact and 60-ish, and opened the door in a way that suggested she had sized up the situation in the 3 seconds before she said anything and had already made her decisions. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Daniel. 3 rooms, Evelyn said. Pierce stepped back from the door. $2 a night each. Breakfast included, she said. I don't ask about business. I appreciate that, Evelyn said. The rooms were small and cold, but each had a working stove, and within an hour the cold had been addressed. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her room and looked at the wall and thought, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been operating on adrenaline and lists and movement for several days, that she should probably eat and sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought instead, somewhere between what Mrs. Halloran was building and what Evelyn had written down, and what was in Guthrie's survey folder, there was a complete case. All the pieces existed. The question was whether all the pieces could be assembled in front of a judge before Vale could find the thread and pull on it, and she didn't know the answer to that question yet. She heard a knock at her door. Quiet, 2 taps. She opened it. Caleb. He held out a plate, bread, some kind of cold meat, an apple that had seen better days. Pierce fed us, he said. She took the plate. Thank you. He started to turn away. She said, Caleb. He turned back. The survey, she said. The duplicate filing. If it had been gone, it wasn't. But if it had been, would there have been another way? He looked at her, and in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, with the light from the small lamp making shadows across his weathered face, he looked like the version of him she was beginning to recognize, not the legend the town had attached that name to, not the isolated man on the mountain, but the thing underneath both of those, the man who had sat in her kitchen on a frozen Thursday and decided, for Thomas's sake, and for the sake of his own particular code, to stand in the way of Marcus Vale. Yes, he said, you'd have found another way. That's not a compliment, it's an observation. You would have found it. She looked at him for a moment. Get some sleep, she said. You too, he said. She closed the door. She ate the food, standing at the window, looking at the frozen creek behind the building, at the dark shape of the mountains, to the north, where her children were waiting. 3 days. She put the plate down. She took out her list. She read it one more time, looking not for what was there, but for what she might have missed for the gap. The seam, the place where Vale might find leverage, she hadn't seen yet. She found 2 possibilities. She wrote them down. She worked out, carefully, methodically, how she would address them if they materialized. Then she folded the list, put it in her pocket, and went to sleep. She woke the second morning in Helena with the specific alertness of someone who has been sleeping lightly by choice, not necessity. The stove in her room had burned down to coals, and the air had the sharp, close cold of a space that needed the window opened and didn't need it opened at the same time. She built the fire back up before she did anything else, because that was the kind of thing you learn to do. First address the immediate physical problem, then think. 2 gaps she'd identified the night before were still there when she looked at them in the morning light. The first was procedural. Mrs. Halloran's injunction would stop the foreclosure, proceeding temporarily, but Vale's lawyer and Vale would have a lawyer in Helena, she had no doubt of, that would challenge the basis of the injunction and, potentially, get it lifted before the full hearing could be scheduled. The injunction bought time. It was not a conclusion. The second gap was the one she liked less. The December 9th penalty fee was the clearest evidence of fraud in the accounting, but it was evidence that pointed at process, not at Vale personally. It showed that someone at the bank had applied the penalty with foreknowledge of the notification letter's timing. It did not by itself put Vale's hand on the pen. Competent lawyer would argue that Vale, as a board member, could had no direct involvement in daily correspondence procedures, and could not be held responsible for a clerk's administrative error, however suspicious the timing appeared. She needed the clerk. She sat with that thought while the fire came back to life, and she turned it over. And she looked at its edges, and she didn't love it, because it meant finding a person she didn't know in a town where she currently had no standing, and asking that person to expose themselves to the consequences of contradicting Marcus Vale. But it was the gap, and she didn't have the habit of pretending gaps weren't there. She was dressed, and at the small table in her room with the list in front of her when there was a knock at the door. 2 taps Caleb's knock. She'd already identified it as his, which said something about the compressed speed at which you learned people when circumstances removed the usual buffers. She opened it. He was holding 2 cups. Real coffee this time. She could smell it from the doorway. He handed her one without ceremony. "Pierce makes it strong," he said. "Good." She stepped back to let him in, because standing in doorways for conversations that required thinking was inefficient and the hallway was cold. "I need to find the bank clerk who wrote the December notification letter," she said. "Person who processed Vale's correspondence." Caleb sat in the chair she wasn't using. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "That's someone in Cutter's Creek." "Yes. We can't go back to Cutter's Creek." "I know that," she sat. "Mrs. Halloran has a clerk. Mrs. Halloran has, presumably, contacts. The territorial legal community is not large. Lawyers know who the bank correspondents are in the counties they practice in, because that information matters for exactly these situations. You're going to ask her to find the person. I'm going to ask her if she has a way to approach the person without tipping Vale that we're looking." She drank the coffee. It was strong, the kind of strong that felt like a considered decision rather than an accident. "Vale will know we're in Helena by now. He may not know we've been to the land office or to Mrs. Halloran, but he'll know we came here for a reason, and he'll be working out what that reason is. He'll try to move the corrected foreclosure petition before the injunction lands," Caleb said. "That's what I'd do. Then we need the injunction filed today." Mrs. Halloran said 3 days. "She said she needed 3 days to prepare it properly," he said. "That's not the same thing as 3 days being our only option." Evelyn looked at him. "You think she can move faster?" "I think you should ask." She finished the coffee. Put the cup down. "All right," she said. "Let's go." Daniel was already awake, already downstairs at Pierce's table, eating breakfast with the focused efficiency of a teenager who understood this, without being told, that this morning required him to be ready. He looked up when they came down, and she gave him a small nod that communicated, "We're moving." He ate the last of his breakfast in 3 bites and stood up. Pierce watched them leave from behind the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman who had seen people leave her boarding house in various configurations of urgency and had opinions about none of them. The walk to Mrs. Halloran's office was 10 minutes in the cold morning. Helena was quieter at this hour than it had been the previous afternoon. Fewer horses on the street, the commerce not yet fully engaged, the boardwalks mostly empty, towns settling into its day. Evelyn moved through it with her head up and her pace deliberate, in the way she'd learned to move through places where she wasn't certain whether she was being watched, not so fast as to look like someone running, not so slow as to look like someone who had nowhere to be. Mrs. Halloran was already in her office. She was already working, papers spread across her desk and in the organized disorder of a woman who knew exactly where everything was despite how it looked to anyone else. She looked up when the 3 of them came in, registered the hour, registered their expressions, and set down her pen. "The injunction," Evelyn said. "How much of those 3 days is preparation, and how much is procedure?" "About a third preparation," Mrs. Halloran said. 2/3 procedure filing, clerk's office processing, getting it in front of a judge. Can the procedure be compressed? Judge Alderman has a full docket today. "I'm not asking about Judge Alderman specifically," Evelyn said. "I'm asking whether there's a mechanism for emergency injunctive relief that doesn't require the full docket process." Mrs. Halloran looked at her. "You've been thinking." I've been awake. Mrs. Halloran picked up her pen, turned it in her fingers, set it down again. There's a provision for injunctive relief on showing of imminent irreparable harm, she said. If I can demonstrate that Vale is actively moving to file a corrected foreclosure petition which would moot our challenge if it lands first, I can petition for emergency consideration. That requires me to have evidence that he's moving. He's moving, Caleb said. Mrs. Halloran looked at him. Do you have evidence of that? Not documentation. Judgment. I need more than judgment. Evelyn had been looking at the street through the window while this exchange happened. She turned. He has a lawyer in Helena, she said. That's not a guess. A man operating the way Vale operates in that county maintains a lawyer in the territorial capital. The lawyer will have received communication from Vale in the past 2 days. If that communication relates to the foreclosure proceeding, can't access another lawyer's client communications, Mrs. Halloran said. That's not how this works. I'm not suggesting you access them, Evelyn said. I'm suggesting that if Vale has filed anything in the territorial courts in the past 48 hours, that filing is a public record. It would appear in the court clerk's daily log. A pause. Mrs. Halloran looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone making a particular assessment. The daily log is available first thing in the morning, she said slowly. Then someone should look at it, Evelyn said. Mrs. Halloran was already getting her coat. The territorial courthouse was 3 blocks from Mrs. Halloran's office, a more substantial building than the land office knew her, the federal seal properly mounted, the steps cleared of snow. The clerk's office was on the ground floor, a room that smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the specific dry warmth of a wood stove running continuously in an enclosed space. Daily log for the past 2 days took the clerk approximately 4 minutes to locate. Mrs. Halloran reviewed it at the counter with the focused speed of a woman who knew what she was looking for. Evelyn stood beside her and read over her shoulder. Vale's Helena lawyer was named Cutler, R.J. Cutler, with an office on the main street. And on the previous afternoon yesterday, while they had been in this same city, while Evelyn had been sitting on the edge of a boarding house bed, making lists, Cutler had filed a petition on Vale's behalf to amend and refile the foreclosure proceeding against the Harper property. Petition had been logged at 4:47 in the afternoon. Evelyn looked at the timestamp. She had left Mrs. Halloran's office yesterday at approximately 4. Vale's lawyer had filed 47 minutes later. He knew we'd been to see you, she said quietly. Mrs. Halloran said nothing for a moment. She was reading the petition details, her face neutral in the way of a professional keeping her reactions internal. He has someone watching the building, she said, equally quiet. Or watching you specifically. She stepped back from the counter. Come with me. They went back to the office, Mrs. Halloran closed the door, which she hadn't done the day before. Cutler's petition amends the parcel number error, she said. Closes the procedural defect. It's a clean filing. If a judge accepts it, the original foreclosure proceeds on its corrected terms. She looked at Evelyn. We have a narrow window. I can file for emergency injunctive relief on the basis of the pending corrected petition and the accounting irregularities. If I do it this morning, I can request immediate consideration from the duty judge, not alderman, whoever is sitting duty today. It's a different standard, less formal, but it gets us in front of someone today. Then do it today, Evelyn said. I need the full accounting documentation, Mrs. Halloran said. Your list to the ledger copy, Guthrie's survey, and Caleb's signed affidavit about Thomas's letter. She was already writing. The affidavit I can draft in 20 minutes if you. She looked at Caleb, can sign and swear it before the building's notary. Yes, Caleb said. Daniel, your familiarity with the ledger, I need a written statement from you. Dated. Signed. Specific the figures, the dates, the discrepancies you can personally attest to, having seen in the original book. Daniel straightened slightly. I can do that. Sit here. She pointed to a side table and set paper and pen in front of him. She looked at Evelyn. And I need the clerk. I don't have the clerk, Evelyn said. I know, Mrs. Halloran said. But if what you've described about the notification timing is accurate, there's a clerk at the Cutters Creek branch of the Territorial Savings Bank who processed a penalty notice on December 9th that he or she could not have processed without specific instruction from above. That person is either complicit or coerced. She paused. Coerced people, when they understand that someone has already found the evidence, sometimes decide that protecting themselves is more important than protecting the person who coerced them. You know who the clerk is, Evelyn said. It wasn't quite a question. I know a banker in Helena who corresponds with the Cutters Creek branch manager on routine matters, Mrs. Halloran said. I've handled 2 cases involving that branch in the past 4 years. The correspondence clerk in Cutters Creek during that period was a young man named Abbott, Peter Abbott. He came from Missouri about 3 years ago. She set down her pen. He is almost certainly the person who processed Vale's instructions. Can you reach him without Vale knowing? Not directly. But there's a circuit rider who covers that part of the territory for federal banking oversight. He's not on Vale's payroll because nobody's had reason to pay him for anything. He passes through Cutters Creek on a regular schedule. She looked at the clock on the wall. He was due to pass through 4 days ago. Meaning he's already come and gone, Evelyn said. Meaning he's between Cutters Creek and his next stop right now, on the road. She looked at Caleb. How well do you know the territory between here and Cutters Creek? Well enough, he said. The circuit rider's name is Fennec. He travels with a government wagon, blue, with federal markings on the side panel. If someone were to intercept him on the main road and explain the situation, and ask him to return to Cutters Creek for a specific conversation with Peter Abbott, that's a full day's ride east, Caleb said. The emergency hearing won't be scheduled for at least 6 hours, Mrs. Halloran said. If he leaves now and rides hard. I know how to ride, Caleb said. He was already putting his hat on. Evelyn looked at him. You'd be back by tonight? If the wagon is where she thinks it is. He met her eyes. Not, I'll send word. She wanted to say something more than that. She wasn't sure what. The past 3 days had compressed a particular kind of familiarity between them that didn't have a clean name, not friendship exactly. Not the thing it also wasn't yet, but something functional and specific, kind of working knowledge of another person that develops when circumstances strip away everything social, and you see each other in the unadorned version. Ride carefully, she said. He left. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that accumulate strangely. They had a specific weight but no particular texture, each one demanding something slightly different. Mrs. Halloran drafted, and Evelyn reviewed, and Daniel wrote his statement in the careful handwriting of a boy who knew the document mattered and was holding his pen too tight because of it. Evelyn told him once to loosen his grip, and he did for about 3 minutes, and then she watched his knuckles go white again and decided it didn't matter. The content was what mattered. Caleb's affidavit was drafted and sent to the building's notary with a runner. Guthrie's survey was formally attached. The list of 19 discrepancies was organized into a supporting exhibit, with the December 9th item starred at Mrs. Halloran's instruction. At 11 o'clock, Mrs. Halloran filed the emergency petition. Then they waited. Waiting was its own particular skill, and Evelyn had always been middling at it. She did better when she had something to do, and for the 2 hours, while the duty judge reviewed Mrs. Halloran's filing and the clerk's office processed the procedural elements, she had very little to do. She sat in the anteroom of Mrs. Halloran's office, and she thought about her children at Marta Hedstrom's. She thought about whether Bess had cried herself to sleep the past 2 nights, or whether the hard cattle country rhythm of Marta's operation had simply absorbed all 6 of them into its ongoing work. She thought about Hannah managing the younger ones in a stranger's house, deploying the same steady authority she deployed everywhere, in the particular way of a girl who had been managing things since she was old enough to understand what managing meant. She thought about Thomas. Not the way she'd been thinking about him, not in the analytical mode, reconstructing his actions and his knowledge and the timeline of his fear. She thought about him, The way you think about someone when you have a quiet hour and nothing to defend yourself against. The specific way he smelled in winter, wool and cold air, and the wood smoke that lived in every piece of clothing in a frontier house. The way he told stories to the children, pacing himself differently for the twins than for the older girls, adjusting tone and detail for each one without apparently thinking about it. The way he had of going silent when he was worried, not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man saying everything to himself and deciding what to let out. He had known. He had been scared. He had written a letter and trusted it to a man he hadn't seen in years. And then he had kept going, kept farming, kept building, kept being a father to 6 children on a cold Montana frontier, and he had died before the letter could do what he'd needed it to do. She had been furious at him. She was still, in some corner of herself, furious at him. She was also, seeing the scar in the larger part of herself, proud of him in the inarticulate, bone-level way that you are proud of someone whose limitations you understand completely and love anyway. Daniel sat beside her and said nothing. They were well matched in their silences, mother and son. He had his father's quality of useful quiet, the kind that didn't demand anything. At 1 in the afternoon, Mrs. Halloran came out of her office with a document in her hand, and the expression of someone who has received news that is good but not simple. The duty judge granted consideration, she said. Not a full injunction, a temporary stay of the corrected petition, pending a hearing. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Butler will challenge the stay, Evelyn said. He already has. His objection was filed within the hour. Mrs. Halloran sat down. The judge denied the objection provisionally. Vale's petition is stayed until tomorrow morning. Gives us tonight. To get Caleb back with the circuit rider, Evelyn said. That's possible, yes. Abbott's testimony, even a written statement from Abbott, countersigned by Fenwick, as a federal witness, would change the character of tomorrow's hearing significantly. Right now, we have strong circumstantial evidence of fraud in the accounting. Abbott's testimony transforms it into direct evidence. Vale would have a much harder time arguing clerical error if the clerk himself says otherwise. And if Caleb can't reach Fenwick, then we proceed with what we have, Mrs. Halloran said. It's not nothing. The survey, the accounting, Daniel's statement, the affidavit. It's enough to make Vale's position uncomfortable. Uncomfortable enough that his lawyer may try to negotiate before the hearing begins. I'm not interested in negotiating, Evelyn said. I know, Mrs. Halloran said. She said it in the tone of a lawyer who has had this conversation before with clients who meant it and clients who didn't, and was fairly certain which category she was dealing with. The afternoon moved. The light changed. Helena went about its business around them, indifferent to the specific drama being conducted in a small office above a hardware store. Evelyn ate something she couldn't afterward reconstruct what. Something Pierce sent with a runner, bread and cold chicken and an apple, and kept moving through the implications of tomorrow. Vale would be here. She had no doubt of that. A man with his level of investment in this outcome would not stay in Cutter's Creek and let his lawyer manage it alone. He would come, and he would sit in that courtroom, and he would look at her the way he'd looked at her in her kitchen with the comfortable certainty of a man who believed that everything, including this, could be managed. She intended to disabuse him of that certainty. In front of a judge, on the record, Caleb came back at 6 in the evening. She heard his horse in the street before she saw him, which she recognized as a function of the past 3 days. She'd become calibrated to certain sounds, the way the body adjusts when it needs to. He came upstairs without stopping at the street level. He came into the office, carrying cold and trail dust, and something in his expression that was not quite triumph, but was adjacent to it. Fenwick was 12 miles east, he said, on the main road to Billings, right where she said he'd be. He sat down. He looked at Evelyn. He knew about Guthrie. The room went very still. What do you mean he knew? She said. He'd been through Cutter's Creek 4 days ago. He'd had a conversation with Abbott, apparently. Abbott had been trying to find someone to talk to for weeks. He'd been looking for a federal contact because he didn't trust the local law, and Fenwick's the first federal contact he'd seen in months. Caleb reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Abbott gave Fenwick a written statement, signed and witnessed 2 days ago, before we'd even reached Helena. Mrs. Halloran took the document. She opened it, she read. Evelyn watched her read and looked for information in her face and found it, the slight tightening around the eyes that came when something exceeded expectations, and the deliberate smoothing that came after it. The professional containment of a reaction that wanted to be larger than the moment required. Abbott states, Mrs. Halloran said, looking up, niece, that in late November of last year, he was instructed by Marcus Vale directly in a face-to-face meeting at the bank to prepare a penalty notice dated December 9th and to hold the notification letter until December 14th. He states that he protested the instruction and was told that his employment and his professional record were contingent on his compliance. She looked at Caleb. He names Vale by name. He gives the date and location of the instruction. He describes the specific conversation. That's direct testimony, Evelyn said. That's direct testimony, Mrs. Halloran confirmed. Combined with the survey, the accounting discrepancies, and the prior claim, filing, this isn't a difficult case anymore. This is a clear case. She set the document down carefully with the intentionality of someone placing something valuable. Cutler is going to know the moment he sees this document that his client is finished. Vale won't see it that way, Evelyn said. No, Mrs. Halloran said. People like Vale rarely do. The hearing was at 9 the following morning. Evelyn didn't sleep much, not from anxiety exactly, but from the quality of alertness that a hard-fought thing produces in the hours before its conclusion, the mind running checks it doesn't strictly need to run. She was dressed and downstairs at 7. Caleb was already there, at Pierce's table with coffee, and he looked up when she came down with the particular quality of attention she'd gotten used to, the kind that noticed everything and commented on nothing, unless there was a reason. How do you feel? He asked. Ready, she said. That's not what I asked. She sat across from him. I feel like I've been doing arithmetic for 3 days, and I'm about to find out whether I counted correctly. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Feel like Thomas should be here. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, he should. That was the right answer. Not a consolation, not a redirection. Just agreement with the plain truth of a thing. Appreciated it. Daniel came down at 7:30, dressed as carefully as the limited options of his travel pack allowed, which she noted with the private precision of a mother, because it told her he understood the weight of what today was. They walked to the courthouse at 8:45. Vale was already on the steps. She had known she would see him, and she had prepared for it. But there was still a particular quality to actually seeing him, the pressed coat, the watch chain, the same settled certainty he'd carried into her kitchen. He was flanked by Cutler, a lean man in his 40s, with the organized precision of someone who lived in paperwork, and 2 other men she didn't recognize. Vale saw her coming, and something crossed his face, not fear, not quite, but the first version of what fear is before it knows its name. A recalibration, the look of a man who expected to walk into a room, holding most of the cards, and is counting his hand and finding it shorter than he thought. She didn't look at him for longer than it took to register what she needed to register. She kept walking, up the steps, past him, through the door. Judge Alderman was not the duty judge from yesterday. He was older, late 60s, with the unhurried quality of a man who had heard enough cases to have strong opinions about time wasting. He looked at the parties assembled in his courtroom with the same attention he probably gave everything, which was complete and unsentimental. Cutler opened by challenging the admissibility of Abbott's statement on grounds of timeliness. It had not been disclosed in advance of the hearing, he argued, and introducing it this morning was procedurally improper. Mrs. Halloran countered that the statement had been in federal custody with Fenwick for 2 days, that its late delivery to counsel was a function of the emergency timeline, and that its relevance to the fraud allegations at the core of the proceeding was direct and unavoidable. Judge Alderman looked at the statement. He looked at Cutler. "Your objection is overruled," he said, with the tone of a man who considered the objection to have been worth exactly the 3 minutes it took to dispose of it. Cutler's expression did not change. Lawyers of his type had excellent faces. But beside him, Vale's expression changed slightly, and Evelyn watched it from across the courtroom, with the focus she'd been saving for exactly this. The accounting discrepancies came in without significant challenge. Mrs. Halloran walked through them methodically, starting with the smallest and building to the December 9th item, which she presented last and in detail. The judge asked 2 questions. They were precise questions, the kind that indicated he had already understood the significance before asking them. Guthrie's survey came in. The mineralogist's assay came in. Prior claim filing, dated June of the previous year, came in. Caleb testified. He was brief, specific, and entirely consistent with his written affidavit, which Mrs. Halloran had prepared him for the previous evening in a 20-minute session that he'd gone through with the patience of a man who understood that the process required certain things of him and was willing to provide them without making it about himself. Daniel testified. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he held his hands on the railing of the witness chair. Too still. The deliberate stillness of someone managing something physical, but his voice was even, and his recall was precise. And when Cutler cross-examined him and attempted to suggest that a 16-year-old couldn't reliably attest to complex financial records, Daniel looked at the lawyer with the expression of a boy who had been keeping his family's accounts for 3 months and said quietly, "I've been looking at those numbers every day since my father died. I know them." Judge Alderman made a note. Abbott's statement was read into the record. Cutler objected 3 more times during the reading. All 3 objections were overruled. Vale did not testify. Cutler advised against it, clearly, which was the correct legal instinct, and Vale, whatever else he was not a man who defied his lawyer's professional judgment in a setting where defying it cost him something. But he watched. From his seat at the respondent's table, he watched the case being built against him, piece by piece, and Evelyn, from the opposite table, watched him watch it, and she thought about Thomas, about what Thomas would have made of this room, of these proceedings, of the machinery of territorial law that he'd tried to use and hadn't had enough time to engage. He would have been satisfied with it. Not thrilled, Thomas was not given to thrills but satisfied. The way a man is satisfied when something has been done the right way, through the right process, even when the right process is slow and cold, and requires sitting in a room with the man who killed him, and trusting that the law will do what the law is supposed to do. Judge Alderman recessed for 30 minutes at 11 o'clock. 30 minutes was not long. Mrs. Halloran said nothing during it, which was its own information. A lawyer who has made their argument and is reasonably confident in the outcome goes quiet. A lawyer who is worried finds things to say. Evelyn sat and looked at her hands and thought about Marta Hedstrom's cattle operation and whether Hannah had managed the twins without too much attrition. When the judge returned, his expression was the same as it had been throughout, complete and unsentimental. He looked at the papers in front of him and he said, in the measured cadence of a man who was going to be precise because the record required it, that the corrected foreclosure petition filed by R.J. Cutler on behalf of Marcus Vale was denied on the grounds of fraudulent origination, that the original foreclosure was vacated, that the Harper property was confirmed in the name of Evelyn Harper as the surviving spouse, and that the mineral rights claim filed by James Guthrie on behalf of Thomas Harper was entered into the territorial record as a valid prior claim. He said 2 additional things. He said that the accounting irregularities in the record had been referred to the Territorial Banking Authority for review of the Cutters Creek branch of the Territorial Savings Bank. and he said that Abbott's statement had been forwarded to the federal marshal's office for consideration of a criminal investigation into the circumstances surrounding the death of James Guthrie. He did not say Marcus Vale's name in connection with that last item. He did not have to. The room was small enough that the connection was available to everyone in it. Vale stood up. Cutler put a hand on his arm, and he shook it off not violently, but with the specific force of a man who has spent his entire life shaking things off and has not yet accepted that this is a thing he cannot shake off. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. There was nothing to say. She was aware of that and appeared to be the only person in the room who was. Caleb, standing against the side wall where he'd positioned himself at the start of the hearing, was watching Vale with the steady attention of a man who is prepared for variables. Daniel was at her left shoulder, close enough that she could feel the tension in him wound up, ready for something, the adrenaline of the past hour looking for an outlet. Vale said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, and Cutler guided him toward the door with the experienced handling of a lawyer, moving a client before the client does something that makes the situation worse, and the door opened and they were gone. The room exhaled. Mrs. Halloran began gathering her papers with the organized efficiency of a woman moving to the next thing. Court clerk was making notations. Judge Alderman had already turned to the file for his next case. Evelyn sat for a moment. Just a moment. Not from emotion, she was not in an emotional place right now, or rather the emotion was there, but behind something, held back by the same mechanism that had been holding things back for 3 months, and she did not have the correct private space for it to come down yet. She sat because she needed 30 seconds to let the shape of it settle. Property was theirs. The mineral claim was on record. Vale's accounting was going to be reviewed, which meant every person he'd done this to, and she did not believe for a moment that they were the only ones had a thread to pull on now. Guthrie's death was in federal hands. Thomas had tried to do this. Thomas had been trying to get to this exact outcome, and he hadn't made it, and she had. She sat with that for 30 seconds. Then she stood up. Daniel was looking at her. His jaw was still tight, but there was something different in his face now. Not relief exactly, something rawer than relief. Something that would need more time and more privacy to fully resolve itself. "We need to get to Marta Hedstrom's," she said. "Your sisters are waiting." He made a sound, not a word, more the sound of something loosening that had been held too long. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay." Mrs. Halloran shook Evelyn's hand at the courthouse door. It was a firm, brief handshake, the handshake of a professional who does not make it personal and does not need to, because the work speaks well enough for itself. "The mineral rights claim will attract buyers, Mrs. Halloran said. "When you're ready to navigate that, I'd recommend a Helena firm rather than anything closer to Cutter's Creek." "I'll keep that in mind," Evelyn said. "You have a strong case for civil damages against Vale, personally, separate from the criminal referral," Mrs. Halloran said. "When you're ready for that conversation." "One thing at a time," Evelyn said. Mrs. Halloran nodded. She went back inside. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in the February cold, with Caleb on one side and Daniel on the other, and looked at Helena around them, the street, the buildings, the ordinary life of a territorial capital, going about its Thursday in complete indifference to what had just happened inside that building. "How long to Marta's?" she asked Caleb. 4 hours, if the weather holds." She looked at the sky. The weather looked like it intended to hold. "Then we leave now," she said. They retrieved their things from Pierce's boarding house, paid the bill. Caleb paid it before she could reach for her own money, and she let him because the argument about it could wait until there was time for the kind of principled disagreement that required energy she needed for the ride, and were on the road north by early afternoon. The ride was different from the journey down. Not easier, physically the same country, the same cold, the same long haul through winter terrain, but different in the specific way that the same road is different when you know where you're going and why and what you're coming back to. She didn't think about Vale on the ride. She thought about the children. She thought about Bess's face when she saw her mother coming, the particular configuration that face would make, which she could construct in her mind with complete accuracy because she had 17 years of practice in reading that face. She thought about Hannah, who had asked her to be back in 5 days and was going to get her in 4. She thought about the northeast quarter, the creek that ran along its base, the ridge above it, the place where Guthrie had taken his samples. She had never particularly thought about that section of the property before. It was rocky ground, hard to farm, more useful as grazing than cultivation. Thomas had planned to run cattle on it eventually when they had enough animals to justify the expansion. She thought about what it meant to have something beneath the ground that changed the calculation of everything above it. And she thought about how she felt about that. And the feeling was complicated in ways she didn't have language for, yet gratitude for the security it represented, something unsettled about what it would change. And underneath both of those, the stubborn knowledge that the farm itself, the work of it, the daily unglamorous maintenance of living on and from a piece of land, was still the thing she understood. The mineral claim was a tool. The land was home. Daniel rode beside her and said, after a long while, "Do you think they'll arrest Vale?" "I think it depends on what the federal marshal finds," she said. Abbott's statement establishes Vale's involvement in the accounting fraud, whether it's enough to build a criminal case around Guthrie that requires more. They'll look, she said. That's something. It's not enough, he said. For Dad. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. It's not enough for that. There isn't enough for that. She looked at him. But it's more than he had 2 weeks ago, and it's more than Vale expected anyone to get. That matters. Daniel looked at the road ahead of them. His jaw moved slightly, working through something. He thought we had nothing, he said. Yes, he thought you had nothing, he said, and there was something in the way. He said it, a precision, a 16-year-old's recognition of something that deserved to be named. Most people did, she said. He was wrong, Daniel said. Came out flat, not triumphant, just factual. The assessment of a boy who had watched his mother walk into a territorial courtroom with a list of 19 discrepancies and a dead surveyor's duplicate filing and the testimony of a mountain man, and walk out with the deed to their land. Caleb, riding slightly ahead, said nothing. He didn't look back, but Evelyn noticed that the set of his shoulders had changed slightly, the quality of his presence, and she filed that alongside everything else. She was still learning to read about this man who had ridden into her yard 11 weeks late and changed the shape of things. Marta Hedstrom's place came into view in the low angle of the late afternoon light, a working cattle operation that had none of the aesthetic concerns of a farmhouse built with any other thought than function. The barn was larger than the house. The fences were good. The yard was packed by the movement of animals and people, and had the honest look of somewhere that had been used hard for a long time, and was better for it. She heard Bess before she saw her. A small shape came running from the direction of the barn, moving with the full-body urgency of a 3-year-old, for whom running and throwing themselves at someone were not 2 separate activities but one continuous motion. Evelyn crouched down from her horse, which was not graceful, and caught Bess mid-trajectory and held her, the warm, solid weight of her smallest child pressing into her shoulder and making the particular sounds that 3-year-olds make when they are so relieved that they don't have language for it. She held on. Over Bess's head she could see the others coming from the house. Hannah first, with the careful, measured walk, a moke of someone holding herself together until she's sure it's actually over. Then Clara at her side, then the twins at a full run and already arguing about who saw their mother first. She held Bess and watched them come and felt the thing she'd been holding back for 3 days, for 11 weeks, for the entire duration of this specific kind of surviving, come up through her chest and into her throat, and she did not cry. Not exactly, but it was close, and she decided that close was all right. It was all right. They went home. Not immediately. There were practicalities. the kind that don't pause for emotional resolution. Marta Hedstrom fed them all that evening. A meal that was plain and large and exactly what 8 people who had been surviving on dried goods and borrowed shelter needed, Marta herself said, little through the meal, which Evelyn recognized as a specific kind of respect, the respect of someone who understood that the people at her table had been through something and didn't need it discussed over supper. The children were settled. Evelyn sat with Marta at the kitchen table and said plainly that she owed her, and Marta said just as plainly that she didn't. "Your daughter kept my youngest from burning himself on the stove twice," Marta said, "and she reorganized my pantry in a way I've been meaning to do for 2 years. Consider it even." They left the next morning and reached the Harper farm by nightfall. The farm looked the same. That was the first thing that struck her. It looked exactly the same as it had when she'd stood in the doorway and watched Vale's wagon pull away empty, and she didn't know why she'd expected it to look different. The barn was there. The house was there. The frozen creek ran along the base of the northeast quarter in the same indifferent way it always had, carrying snowmelt toward the valley with no awareness of what lay in the rock beneath it. She stood in the yard for a moment before going inside. Caleb stood a few feet back, giving her the space she hadn't asked for and needed anyway. The children filtered past her into the house, Hannah first, already assessing what's needed doing. Then the twins. Then Clara. Then Daniel with Bess on his back, because Bess had fallen asleep in the last mile and he hadn't woken her. They went in one by one and the house received them, which was what houses do when the right people come back to them. "You don't have to stay," she said to Caleb. Not to push him away, she had stopped pretending somewhere between Helena and Marta's kitchen that she wanted him to leave. But she was a woman who had spent 11 weeks learning not to assume anything, and she was not going to start assuming now. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she'd learned to read, not evasion, just honest consideration. "I know," he said. "But," she said. "No, but," he said. There's work to do on the north fence. I noticed it coming down. Posts are rotted. Left too long, you'll lose animals in the spring." She looked at him. He was looking at the fence line in question, evaluating it with the professional detachment of a man who had found a task to describe, because the real answer was sitting underneath it and didn't need to be spoken yet. "Cabin's still there," she said. "On the mountain. You don't have to give it up." "I'm not giving it up," he said. "I'm saying the fence needs work." She understood. She let it be what it was, a beginning that knew it was a beginning, and wasn't in a hurry to be more than that. Some things needed to be built the way the fence needed to be built, post by post, with patience in the right season. "In the morning, then," she said. She went inside. Federal Marshal's offices opened its investigation into the death of James Guthrie the following month. It took another 4 months for the investigation to produce enough for a criminal indictment. Marcus Vale was arrested on a Wednesday in June, which was, Evelyn later learned from Mrs. Halloran in a letter. The same day, the Territorial Banking Authority revoked the Cutters Creek branch's operating charter, pending a complete audit of its lending records. The audit, when completed, identified 3 other families who had been subjected to similar manufactured debt proceedings. 2 of those families recovered their property. One had already left the territory, and their land was held in escrow, pending a claim that Mrs. Halloran was quietly preparing on their behalf. Peter Abbott testified against Vale in exchange for reduced exposure on the fraud charges. His testimony was, by all accounts, specific and damning. Vale's lawyer argued for leniency on grounds of his client's contribution to the county's economic development, which the territorial judge found unpersuasive. Evelyn did not go to the trial. She had said everything she needed to say in a Helena courtroom in February, and she saw no reason to go back. She had a farm to run, and a mineral rights negotiation to navigate, and 6 children who required the ongoing fact of her presence, and all of that seemed more important than watching a verdict delivered to a man she had already stopped thinking about. The mineral claim was sold to a mining consortium from Denver in the autumn, not Cheaply, Mrs. Halloran had been right that the rights attracted serious buyers, and Evelyn had been right that the right firm to negotiate the sale was in Helena rather than anywhere closer. The terms included a percentage royalty on extraction yields and a provision that the surface land remained Harper property in perpetuity. She had insisted on the perpetuity clause, and she had gotten it because by then she had learned that insisting, clearly and without apology, was a different thing than demanding, and people responded to it differently. The money changed things. She would be a liar if she said otherwise, and she had no interest in being a liar. It meant the children's futures had options they hadn't had before. It meant Daniel, who wanted to read law and had kept that want to himself in the way of a practical boy who doesn't talk about things that aren't possible, could go to Helena in the fall and find out whether they were possible after all. It meant Hannah's particular intelligence would have somewhere to go besides the management of a frontier household, though Hannah took the news of her expanded options with the calm of a girl who had always been certain of herself and didn't need external confirmation to stay that way. Caleb fixed the north fence. Then he fixed the roof on the barn, which had been losing shingles for 2 winters, and which Thomas had been planning to address in the spring. Then he stayed through that spring, and the following winter, and somewhere in the ordinary accumulation of seasons and work and meals, and the children growing in the specific way that children grow when they are safe and fed and argued with and challenged somewhere in all of that, Cabin on the Mountain became a place he went when he needed quiet, and the Harper farm became the place he came back to. He and Evelyn did not talk much about what they were to each other for a long time. They were both people who had been through losses that didn't invite easy replacement, and they understood without discussing it that what was building between them needed to be built at its own pace. In the practical daily language, they both spoke the fence and the fire, and who saw to the horses and what needed to be decided about the royalty dispute in the 3rd year, and whether Bess was developing a reading difficulty or just stubbornness, which turned out to be stubbornness. They married in the 4th year. It was a small thing with a territorial magistrate in Billings and the 6 children as witnesses and Marta Hedstrom as the only other guest, which was how both of them wanted it. Afterward, they went back to the farm, and Hannah made dinner. And the twins broke 2 things, and Bess fell asleep before dessert, and Daniel made a formal toast that was both slightly too long and entirely right. And Caleb sat at the table in the house that had been built for a different family, and looked around at the faces at that table, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. What Evelyn understood in those years and after was something she hadn't expected to understand when she'd stood in the frozen yard watching Marcus Vale walk away from the auction he'd intended to hold. She had believed, in the worst weeks after Thomas died, that survival was the goal. Get through. Keep the children fed. Keep the family together. Survive the winter, and then the next one. But survival was the floor, not the ceiling. The actual work, the hard, unglamorous, daily work, was not just enduring. It was building something from what you had in the season you were in, with the people who were actually there. Not the people you'd lost, not the life you'd planned, the one you had. Thomas had taught her that, without knowing he was teaching it. He'd built a farm on rock-hard Montana ground with his hands and his patience, and the specific stubbornness of a man who believed that the work was worth doing, even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He had been right about that. He had been right about Caleb, too, that what she would need was not someone to rescue her, but someone to give her room. She thought about him most mornings, in the first hour before the house woke up, when the farm was still and the light was just coming, and everything was quiet in the way that things are only quiet before the day's accounting begins. She thought about him without grief, mostly or with grief that had become, over time, a different shape. Less a wound, more a weight she'd learned to carry without it slowing her down. He would have liked what the farm became. He would have liked Caleb, the way 2 men like each other, when they share a quality of quiet that doesn't need to perform itself. He would have worried about Daniel reading law, and then been proud of him. and then worried again, that was Thomas, all the way down. He would have found Bess's stubbornness funny. He always did. The frontier is not a place that rewards sentiment. It rewards competence and patience and the willingness to do the work in front of you without waiting for better conditions. Evelyn Harper had known that since she was a girl in Nebraska watching her father get up before light every morning, regardless of what the previous day had taken from him. She had carried it through 17 years of marriage and 6 children and one terrible winter and a courtroom in Helena and all the ordinary difficult days that came after. What she had not known, what nobody had told her, because it was the kind of thing that couldn't be told, only lived, was that doing the work in front of you, day after day, in the company of people you chose, and who chose you back, was not just surviving. It was the thing itself. It was enough.